Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Dwayne Schultes. I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation. I'd like to thank you for joining us for Cancer and COVID-19, Short-Term Reality, Long-Term Vision. This is our first webinar in a series in partnership with EFPIA, investigating the impact of COVID-19 on cancer treatment and cancer care in Europe. We will be taking questions in the last half hour of the webinar. Now, that being said, we've had 700 registrations for this webinar. I'll say that again. We've had close to 700 registrations. So we will do our best to take your questions, but obviously we will be prohibited from doing everybody's questioning, but we'll do our best to make sure all of your questions are answered. So access to cancer care and treatments was a topic of debate around Europe even before the onset of COVID-19. And there are mounting concerns of the potential impact of COVID-19 on oncology treatment in general after the pandemic is under control. What does the current situation mean for cancer patients in terms of access to new care, new medicines, as well as timely diagnosis? And what are the main challenges for industry as to how it can contribute and mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 on cancer patients? And finally, how will this impact the European Commission's Beating Cancer Plan, which is currently under public consultation? And of course, we have a fantastic panel here today to discuss this. So starting with, on the upper left of the chart, Bettina Ryll, the founder of the Melanoma Patient Network Europe. Bettina, hello, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Thank you, Bettina. We're also joined by Nathalie Moll, the Director General of EFPIA. Hello, Nathalie.
Hi, Dwayne. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Representing the European Commission, Martin Seychell, Deputy Director General of Health, Food and Safety, Director General Santé of the European Commission. Martin, pleasure, always a pleasure.
My pleasure. Hello to everyone.
And finally, Maati Aapro, the President of the European Cancer Organization. Maati, thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for organizing this.
So to begin, the first question that we have, we'll start with the patient's perspective. What is your greatest concern of the impact of COVID-19 on cancer treatment? So Bettina, from a patient perspective, what is the thing that's concerning you most right now?
So for a little bit of background, I have founded a European Cancer Patient Network in melanoma after my husband died of melanoma in 2012. And we are one of those cancers where access to new therapies has become really, really important for a chance to survive. And we have seen enormous progress. When my husband was diagnosed, median survival was 6 to 9 months. And now we expect half of our stage 4 patients to survive. And that happened over a very short amount of time. So for us, access to innovation has always been a big, big topic. Now, all of a sudden, COVID comes along and that disrupts the entire system. And what we have seen among our patients is that treatments all of a sudden are postponed, are altered, because some of these new treatments have severe side effects. And now patients are put on options that are less effective, but also less toxic. And this was the starting point that we realized that it popped up on our forums, and we started worrying about what would happen to our people, because of course we don't want to go back to the former times that we all fear so much. So some of that, and we will touch on that later in the discussion, some of that turned out not to be entirely true, but we have already seen postponing of earlier diagnosis after hopefully the end of this pandemic. And in addition to the direct effect on patients, what worried us is that all our countries, or most of our countries at least, struggle with capacity in their intensive care units. Most of our countries have published criteria how those few places will be allocated. Come first served basis, but they are very strict criteria. And I can tell you, if you have a cancer diagnosis, you do not land up on top of that priority list. So in addition to having cancer, you know that if you do get COVID and you do need intensive care, you're not going to be on that priority list. So we've used that to push our people to take care of themselves, to stay out of ways of harm, and to use any protective measures they have in order not to catch COVID. And of course, everyone, we will see the end of this. We are already preparing to move out of this pandemic, but everyone else will go back to normal while we go back to cancer. So the next worry for us is what will happen to our people once we have to pick up the pieces after this pandemic. There will be economic impact, and what will happen to the lives of our people back then. So I think it's like a worry, that a threat that goes through it. And we are obviously not the only ones. Cancer is my field, but there are other patient populations who equally suffer from this and will suffer after the end of it. So I think we have to start thinking about those populations who will not be just going back to normal.
Thank you. And Martin, from the policy perspective, what do you see as the impact of COVID-19 right now?
Well, of course, when faced with a shock of these proportions, and of course the duration of this is still unclear. It's not something that will be a short term. We obviously have to anticipate that it will have a major impact. But I think the key to answering this question is how we approach the recovery. We are still, of course, very much in an acute phase of this. So we have to right now make sure that we are dealing with this in the right way so that the damage is not amplified and it's not prolonged more than necessary. But we should also start to think about what the post-COVID world will look like. I think there are also encouraging signs, if I could use the word encouraging very cautiously in a situation like this, but there are clear signs that the role of health and healthcare and health systems is being reconsidered in a positive way, because what this crisis has demonstrated amply, I think, is that there are structural weaknesses in our healthcare systems. For just to mention one example, we realized how weak our primary and community care systems are, and that accounts for a big part of the damage which COVID is doing. So I think, if we take the lessons that we will have to learn from this and understand what went wrong and why things went wrong, we could actually have a good foundation, a reasonable foundation to put certain things right. So I would hope and I would expect that after a crisis of this magnitude, we move away finally from seeing health as just a cost and recognizing, and I think nobody doubts that anymore, that investing in health is one of the strongest, most important investments that governments can make. So if we get that right, then we obviously can have some hope for the future.
Thank you, Martin. Nathalie, from your perspective, from industry, investing in health, that probably sounds good. From your greatest concern, from your impacts of COVID-19, what do you see for your members?
Thank you, Dwayne. I mean, specifically here, focus on the topic of today. Really, our first and immediate concern is with cancer patients and the continuation of their care. And Bettina touched on that. These patients were already going through very stressful times before, and that's an understatement. And now with the wide-ranging impact of COVID-19 pandemic on even the most basic aspects of daily life, we're trying to do everything we can to help them, to help healthcare providers as well, not only in actually getting the treatments and with the supply, but being able to administer them and how we can adapt the various situations to everything that you can think of and that normal people are facing today, that people who are healthy are facing today, never mind people who have cancer. Secondly, we're very concerned about continuing to develop new treatments for oncology patients, because of course we can't really afford to press a pause button for 3 months while the situation hopefully gets back to some kind of normality. We need to continue our clinical trials even in these very stressful times. And we're working together with EU institutions like the Commission, like the European Medicines Agency, and also national regulators to find the most pragmatic ways to be able to continue those clinical trials. We're facing many unexpected hurdles, even such as patients not being able to participate in the trials anymore because they can't move or because they're sick themselves, and many other different obstacles. And we're really trying, working around the clock, week by week, to try to resolve some of those issues. I'd like to say everything else we can figure out. And as Martin was saying, the collaboration is the most important element of what we're seeing today. The collaboration and the understanding of the value and the complexity of healthcare. Hopefully this crisis brings those things to the forefront and gives us also new ways of dealing with some of the things that we found difficult to resolve in the past.
Thank you, Nathalie. And finally, from the NGO perspective, European Cancer Organization, obviously you folks have been impacted. You have one of the largest conferences, which is probably going to be impacted. I mean, how else is this impacting you directly and your members, Maati?
Well, thank you for asking this. I'm here representing the European Cancer Organization, ECCO, which is an umbrella organization of 28 different organizations dealing with cancer. and very much involved also with the patient voice. And we do have a patient advisory committee of 17 patient associations, and they are actually part of the executive committee, represented by one of them. The obvious impact of this COVID crisis has been that for many of our associations, there have been changes in the plans, in the way they can work, in the fact that some important conferences that bring innovation to be known by everyone have been either postponed or actually canceled in some situations, like for the Supportive Care Association. They actually canceled it altogether from June to June next year. And the patient organizations have had to face the reality of the communication that has been done around the COVID, putting to the forefront the so-called risk of the cancer patient that we might want to discuss later, which is certainly true in some settings, but it's not universally true. The situation in our societies has been that we have had to reorganize. This has shown how flexible we can be and how we can continue to work with the European Commission, with the development of the Beat Cancer Plan, with the work of the mission. And I think though there will be some changes and some slowdowns, I'm very positive that we will continue, because the future is that we will get rid of this problem, but we still have a huge problem, which is cancer, to deal with.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Maati. And thank you for all of your inputs. Now, just going forward here, Commission President von der Leyen, as well as Commissioner Kyriakidis, have put forward Europe's Beating Cancer Plan to strengthen an approach at every stage of the disease, prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and follow-up. Obviously, this is under consultation now. The plan was already moving forward. How do we think this is going to be impacted, given the fact that we're dealing with COVID-19 now? How will this change? Let me see, Nathalie, I'll start with you this time. What do you reckon from the standpoint of your position? What do you think is going to have to move now in the plan as it stood before COVID-19?
Well, it's clear that, as other speakers have already said, I mean, in the current emergency, we need to be focused on what's immediately needed. So indeed, all our efforts are focused there, while making sure that we continue to care for our other patients. But the cancer challenge is not going to disappear. And once we move back to a certain degree of normality, we really should start again working on the mid and long-term challenges, such as cancer, one of which is cancer. So cancer is the second biggest disease burden, and we really feel that Europe's Beating Cancer Plan is needed, is necessary, and should continue to be supported. When we look at the impact that COVID will have had on all our systems, including funding and multi-annual frameworks, etc., I think we need to be very pragmatic and analytical, working together to understand what we cannot afford not to address when things go back to normality, rather than having knee-jerk reactions as to what did we miss during the pandemic and how do we fix that. I think we need to look at everything together and give the right level of priority. And we can only do that really working together with all the stakeholders, because every individual stakeholder will have perhaps a different view of what is important after the COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you. And Martin, from your perspective inside of the building, how are things changing given the reality on the ground, as it were?
Well, I mean, the fight against cancer remains a major priority for the Commission, and work is still going on. And obviously, as you mentioned, the public consultation is still proceeding. I'm very glad to say we're still getting a constant flow of responses from stakeholders. That's very good. And we're already analyzing as they're coming in. I think our original assessment that we need to focus on cancer in a holistic way remains very valid, and that's supported by all the stakeholder comments we've received so far. So we need to look at prevention, we need to look at diagnosis, treatment, survivorship, palliative care, the social dimension. I think there are two main challenges that are kind of now added on by COVID. First is, I think we can't ignore the fact that COVID has had an enormous disruptive effect. Screening programs in many countries have been suspended or had to be postponed. We know the problems of cancer patients, the need to access treatment. So I think we may also need to include, as part of the recovery I mentioned previously, how we also avoid that indirect effects of COVID are, potentially they could be much bigger than the direct impact, and that's something we have to address. The second aspect we have to address, because the cancer plan, as you all know, was also designed to be a very much with the involvement of citizens, stakeholders, etc. Now, the current situation has, of course, put a spanner in the works on this, but we would like also to see how we can, as quickly as circumstances would allow, provide this opportunity, because we don't think a cancer plan should be something that the Commission should just come down and kind of dictate. It needs to be very much recognizing the fact that the expertise, the knowledge is with patients, with stakeholders, with professionals, with researchers, with industry, and that hasn't changed. So we will need to find a way to kind of catch up on the lost time and make sure that that dimension is not lost. But definitely it remains a major priority for the Commission. And if anything, I think this crisis has shown just how important it is to address major health challenges. Even when you think you are reasonably in control, you have to make sure that you are really in control of the situation. And I think, we know there are major issues, challenges with cancer. I just mentioned quickly the inequalities dimension, which remains true and maybe even more true in the post-COVID scenario.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one of the things you brought up, which is really important, is this idea that currently treatment is on hold. And Bettina, I'd love to get to you and follow up with that. But first, Maati, some of the points that Director General Seychell was making about the input. How is ECCO currently working on this in collaboration with trying to feed back to the Commission? How has your group been involved, and how are you working in the consultation process?
Well, thank you for asking. I think that Martin made some very, very important points, and indeed, in our contacts from ECCO and many of its member organizations with the Commission and with the mission, we have seen that the work is going on. The work is difficult in some settings, but it's there. We are progressing. We are very appreciative of the fact that there is a consultation going on with, I would say, everyone that has something to say. And then it will become a very difficult time for those that have to take the decisions to see how they prioritize. And even that, I understand, is going to be then reconsulted on, so that we have, first of all, the patient voice, and Bettina will be talking right after me, and then the voice of those that are in the forefront of the fight against cancer. One of the points that I think this crisis has shown to us, and which was very clearly stated at the meeting that Health Commissioner Stella Kyriakides had with the Envy Committee of the Parliament, was that there is a demonstration here that we really need some European coordination in health, much more than what we have had until now. And this has been also one of the trends I have seen in the suggestion for the Beat Cancer Plan and for the mission, is that there's a lot that we can do if we do it together, much better than if the countries or the regions in the countries do by themselves.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we have several questions about that, which I'd love to get to. But first, I'm going to jump here to question 4. And Bettina, this is something that Martin Seychell had brought up about the fact that we've stopped treatment. Right now, basically, we're only dealing with emergency procedures. Given the 4 areas, prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and follow-up, how are we going to have to prioritize moving forward? What are we going to need to do, and what should we prioritize from a patient perspective?
Okay. First, I quickly would like to comment on the point above. So I am on the Cancer Mission Board, which is an activity of these DG research. And I think something that I would like to add to what the previous speaker said, that I must say that we've had something like a perfect constellation, that both DG saw the health part of our systems and the research part of their system had put cancer on top of their priority list. And we haven't been so lucky in the past. And I think this is something that is often not, that people are not aware, that we drive research in one way and then we drive health in another part, and that these two parts often don't interact. And I think that we lose a lot of valuable time, knowledge, progress, because the interaction hasn't been there. And COVID in that respect is maybe doing us a favor. I mean, I'm very careful. I don't want to put any positive spin on this disaster. Our people are dying. There is nothing positive in that. However, I think the understanding that this working together, and maybe not just between research in health, but also economy and tech, is critical to find a solution out of this crisis, is, from my perspective, hopefully something that we will remember once we're out of this, and that this knowledge and this interaction will pertain and hopefully drive progress in cancer where we equally need it. Because something that is often said in our community is, well, everyone is worried about COVID patients dying today, but we lose more cancer patients and no one screams. How is that even possible? And I think there's a very, it's nasty to say, but there's a valid undertone to that. So I think it's something for us to remember once we're out of this emergency crisis. And now your question about is, what do we do afterwards? And that is maybe something that I would say is one of the unexpected positive aspects that we have seen, and that's now very specific to my cancer, namely melanoma, where countries are already now requesting strategies how to prioritize the patient, the backlog we're going to see afterwards. We open up, but there will be many, many patients who haven't been seen for a long time. In some cases, they report that 75 to 80% of referrals are not happening anymore in oncology. So there's a large number of patients standing there waiting. And we know that not every cancer patient has the same risk. So it should not be the one who was there first gets seen first. In an ideal world, we would take the most urgent first to minimize the damage that has been done. And we have now seen like calls for innovative strategies, and we are quite excited about something that is called, like, it's a risk stratification tool, like on early lesions and melanoma, specifying or identifying patients that have particularly aggressive forms. And that would be then putting research directly into our healthcare systems to hopefully pick out those patients who really need intervention first and save lives that way. That would have never happened so fast without COVID. So I think we should be looking for these things. We are forced now. We have a bottleneck. We have to deal with shortages, but it could help us to develop strategies how we can do this in the future, because we should not be treating. I mean, we all talk about it, personalized medicine. I mean, it's just like, it's such a buzzword. I can't hear it anymore. But that would be true personalization, that we treat the ones who need it and spare the ones who don't. Reducing toxicity is something that should be something we should be supporting. We have cancer is so prevalent in our societies. If we're not careful in managing toxicity, we're inducing suffering at large scale. If we could reduce that, I think that would have huge impact for us, for everyone. So I do believe that there is a grain of an opportunity in there, a learning. It's forced, it's not something we wanted, but it's often like this with lessons in life, right? We didn't ask for it, but it turned out to be valuable in the end. So I think that's something we should think of. How do we minimize the damage that COVID did to our people? So we need strategies that allow us to pick out those patients we should see first, and then walk down the line and remember that lesson, that we can hopefully use it in the future.
Thank you, Bettina. And I'm going to go back then to question 3, because that plays into, this question now. I mean, essentially, we're seeing an enormous impact economically, 50 billion euros a month in Spain and Italy, given the shutdown, according to the IMF. How do we ensure that we're not jettisoning or losing access to effective treatments due to economic impact? I will go to you first, Martin. How do you see this playing out, that we make sure we keep on top of this, even though the realities of what we're going to be dealing with?
Yes, well, there are many, many facets to this. First of all, again, I think it's important not to make the mistake, once again, of seeing that this is somehow just a cost, and that the only way to climb out of this is to kind of clamp down on spending or investment. I mean, that would be the wrong approach. That would just prolong the misery and magnify the impact. I think, first of all, First thing is we need to make sure that this crisis does not last longer than it needs to last, which means we have to be very careful in the next phases to not to make mistakes, which, of course, can always happen. We are in a difficult situation, but it's very important to learn from what happened in January and February and actually avoid repeating some of those things again. And that can help. Secondly, is to also understand that this COVID pandemic has exposed some fault lines in our health system, some basic weaknesses. And this is also relevant for cancer care. And this is where we should refocus our attention. I mean, and the cancer plan had already highlighted and will highlight a number of areas. For example, if we take prevention, 40% of all cancers are preventable, yet they still happen. Now, this is, again, something we could be and should be much better at, but the level of spending we know in prevention programs is minimal. Diagnosis, the 3 types of cancer, at least, where we know that screening can make a big difference. We know that participation rates in many countries are still low. Now, there will need to be, certainly in the recovery phase, an intensification of those screening programs. First of all, to make sure that we identify patients who will need treatment, and we will obviously discover, unfortunately, I'm sure, more patients who have not been detected because of the suspension of programs, etc. But we also should use the opportunity to improve the participation rates, make sure there are no disadvantaged groups dropping out of the screening programs. It's not good enough to have 30, 40%, even 60% of people who should be screened actually being screened. We need to get much better than that. And this is really now not just an opportunity, it's a necessity. We have to do this because otherwise we will not be able to match resources with the needs. Same goes for the investment in research, in new treatments, etc. This is actually a big part of the recovery which needs to happen. Again, this crisis has also exposed that we may not have been investing enough at national level, at European level, in innovation, in taking the results of innovation to the market. And the answer cannot be to invest less. It has to be that we need to invest more, also be better prepared for these kind of shocks. And shocks could take many forms. It could be a communicable disease, but cancer has been causing a huge impact for years, as others have pointed out. And it's something that we could, and this is the reason why the cancer plan remains a high priority, is that there is now, I think, an increased imperative to tackle this. And that is how I hope everybody will see this.
Now, Maati had brought up a really interesting point. We also had a similar question here that was submitted by one of the registrants, and Uma Dellery from the AIFD. Is there any sort of centralized, standardized guidance that the EU can have? Obviously, healthcare is a member state competence, we know that, but how much room does the EU have to set prioritization? And then Maati had asked this, and as we've had a question here, where do we put the bar between, allowing member states to experiment, and how much should we put in as far as setting policy in here in Brussels? Martin, would you care to jump on that? Or?
Martin.
Well, it's of course an important question. I mean, I think the issue is what do we mean by competence? Of course, there's a very valid reason why member states are responsible for running their health systems, because health systems have to be designed as close to the people as possible. But on the other hand, I think we certainly should allow for experiments, but there should also be, member states should be learning from each other as they perform those experiments. We should learn from each other's successes and failures, and the European Commission is playing and can play a great role, I'm sure, in facilitating the process. We can support that process with funding, and I'm sure that this crisis will trigger a new discussion about how we could use the considerable European funding to even greater effect than it has been in the past, in all areas, in support, not in replacement of, but in support of well thought through national and regional strategies in health. I mean, I mentioned earlier the big challenge of inequalities. This for me is one of the biggest challenges which really the European Commission is mostly concerned about, because we cannot afford to have a big difference in even basic things like, you know, survival rates, access to treatment, access to screening, just because people happen to live in one region or another. This is unacceptable. And it's people like me who work in the European Commission, it's our job to tackle these issues. And this is the main reason why we're here. So, we will have to make sure that this is actually tackled through the right instruments. I am sure, I'm confident that there will be an increased focus on research. I think there's going to be a very important and healthy discussion on how we nurture the sector in the European Union, the pharmaceutical, the medtech sector, the growing and very promising medical ICT sector. All this is very important for the fight against cancer, because it's only by bringing all these together that we can actually make headway.
Maati, do you have a comment before we proceed?
Well, thank you for asking. I think Martin has made some very important points, and I fully agree with what has been said. I would just like to add that there are two areas that we have been discussing also with the mission and with the Beat Cancer Plan people, including Commissioner Stella Kyriakides, is that within the way we treat cancer patients in different European countries, you realize that there are differences which lead that in some countries it is much more efficient than in others, and we should learn from each other. We should learn how to streamline the process from the first prevention, then to the screening, and then to the treatment, because I think we can save a huge amount of efforts as energy if you use the best possible ways that are available in different European countries, implement them in others, and especially also look at what is really needed. And this is a program that the 28 societies member of ECCO and others that are supporting this effort called the Essential Requirements in Quality Cancer Care, which is really looking at what is the minimum needed in order to go forward. And we don't want to use the word minimum, because our minimum is already a very good step forward in high quality. And this is something that we really have to deal with. And this can be done with reorganization a lot, and will allow us to invest then in what is clearly needed, i.e. the better treatments of all kinds, from surgery to radiation oncology to medical oncology for all cancer types.
Nathalie, do you have any comment?
Yeah, it's difficult not to paraphrase what many people have already said, and it's great that we all agree, so that's really good. I think indeed innovation is everybody's goal, and innovation is only innovation if it can reach the patients. Like every crisis has helped to focus the mind. There are lessons to be learned, and I can see really the biggest lesson is optimization. We need to optimize the way that we do healthcare, the way that we deliver healthcare, the way that we look after diseases such as cancer, screening, diagnosis, treatment, financing. We need to work together on that. Eliminate waste in the system. We really can't imagine a post-COVID reality where 20% of healthcare expenditure is waste. That's just not acceptable. In the cancer area, I think a renewed focus on the total cost per treatment will be helpful. And then, work really on access schemes, pay for value access schemes, make pricing and reimbursement processes ready for future innovation, ready for the combinations, ready for the one-time treatments, for the new technologies like CAR-T and everything else. Just make sure that we are learning from best practices in different countries, in different regions, and sharing with one another. And also make the most of the digitalization of research, for health diagnostics, in silico experimentation. I think the things that we're having to live right now are are giving us some opportunities to continue. So online consultations, the way that we've had to adapt how we interact with patients or with healthcare providers today, we shouldn't lose that tomorrow if it facilitates optimization and if it facilitates then the delivery. And indeed, innovation research, clearly it's jumped to our face how important these areas are if we want to be able to respond to any health challenge, whether it be cancer or whether it be a virus like the one we're experiencing now.
Yeah, thank you, Nathalie. I do want to go over to Bettina quickly before we move on, but just to remind our audience, there are close to 500 of you on. If you would like to submit a question, we'll be taking questions here momentarily. We'll certainly be spending the last 20 minutes or so taking your questions, so please feel free to submit and we will answer that. Bettina, a comment for you. Yes, please, go ahead.
So I actually think that optimization is not sharpen up or it's not cutting it. I actually had to look it up whether it's the same in English, but even in English it is that necessity is the mother of all invention. I think what we are now seeing is true disruption in several areas of healthcare. If you look at 3D printed valves for ventilators, that's something that wouldn't happen under normal times, but this is what we're seeing now. If you follow the discussion that states will not accept any treatment for COVID, it is a price tag that would not make it possible to give it to everyone who needs it. I think there is a potential in there that we should not underestimate. We will not, I don't believe that we will just go back to business as usual with a little bit of embellishment left and right. I do think that there are some streams in there that have really the potential to alter the way how we do nearly anything in health. And that might be telehealth, but that's just a small part of it. You see that when pressure comes and when the needs are so high and people are dying, people are willing to experiment and to accept uncertainty and to learn and to collaborate and to share in a way they usually don't. And then of course you can ask why that is. But I think it's just like there is something underlying that I believe will stay with us and hopefully for the better for everyone in health. And that also applies to research. There are now research initiatives that have popped up that collaborate in a way that you don't usually see. And there's such, I mean, this would be lean research principles applied by definition. And I hope that we all go looking for these best practices and amplify them afterwards, because otherwise we're just going to go back and do a little bit of better. And I hope for more, because our people keep dying and we need more.
And again, picking up on this, Bettina, one of our questions here is about how essentially clinical research is stopped globally. I mean, there is nothing going on because we can't do clinical trials. One of the things that's launched is the IMI just launched Trials at Home, which is one of the largest individual projects that IMI has ever launched, where it's going to actually put diversified clinical trials into homes using telemedicine and telecommunication devices to actually run remote clinical trials. Bettina, starting with you, I mean, does that go a long way? Is that something we're looking for to try and move this forward?
Well, the first thing to start with is clinical trials for us have always been treatment, and our people who fail whom standard therapies fail need clinical trials for a chance to survive, and we've been directly affected. So all the trials we needed have been stopped, or they're delayed and they're not even initiated, or they're not coming to Europe. So we are already feeling that, and we will pay in lives just because what's going to happen on. The problem, I think, the trials at home depends very much on the stage you're at. You can probably do this in a phase 3, but I don't think that a phase 1 will ever be moving home because just of the monitoring needs. So I think it's an important step, but it's just a small part of the puzzle. Because our community right now, it very much depends on where you are in the treatment pathway. If you're reliant on early phase studies, at home one is not going to fix it. So I think we'll have to think even more about how to do that. And it was actually on your previous slide that we need maybe COVID-free entities, and we've been privately discussing this umpty times now, how important testing is. So I think we need some strategies around it to create safe spaces that we can continue some of the work we need, because I very much like the trials at home concept, but I don't think it's going to fix the entire problem, just a part of it.
Nathalie, going to you. I mean, remote clinical trials, diversified clinical trials, remoting at home. How much of this is going to be impactful for what you guys are trying to accomplish at EFPIA right now?
I mean, I think what we're on, and to really have the most generalized application of the adaptations that we've had to take. And the way we've been interacting on this is obviously gathering from our companies what are the things that they're facing and what are the needs that they need addressed in order to ensure that they can continue the clinical trials, because they're not all stopped, but they have had to be adapted a lot. And a really valuable first step was taken by the European Medicines Agency by issuing a Q&A and guidance on this. And they're continuously working on the update. Of course, it will be very important that member states implement the guidance in a similar fashion, so that we don't have different requirements in different countries. I mean, indeed, you know, we've had site closures, quarantines, travel limitations, disruption in supply chain for investigational products. You know, so the risks in discontinuity in the protocol management and data integrity are high. And we really are putting everything we can in place to make sure that we can face those things from a side of industry, but also trying to see how we can facilitate the participation of patients in those clinical trials. So not just, again, I think looking at the whole chain is becoming a much more continuous way of addressing things because of what we're facing today. The challenge is so big.
Thank you, Nathalie. So I'd like to, in the last few minutes we have here, the last 20 minutes, go to some of the questions we've been receiving from the audience. Again, we have plenty we can do, but I think it's really important we reach out to you. And again, there's many of you online, and we're grateful for your participation. Claudia Vascu, thank you for your question. Can we drive some conclusions regarding medical patient data sharing within the EU from the current situation, specifically benefiting cancer treatment in the future? Do we see data sharing now as an impediment? And what do we need to do to improve data sharing for cancer treatment? Let's see. Bettina, I'll go to you. What do you reckon? What do you think right now?
I think so. Like, well, there are several levels to this. So I do think that data sharing has always been possible if you really want it, but it's often not happening for a diversity of reasons. I also think that a lot of people have quite naive ideas about how data just as we own one place and then we solve all, which I think this is how it is, I freely admit. So I believe we have to evolve our concepts about how we share data and about standards and adaptability while respecting GDPRs and national law. So I think it's the system around it. We've been in our community doing quite a bit of education on data and data management and why this is important. So I think there is a lot already out there that we usually don't see or don't use. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Data sharing and the pressure is like with anything in innovation. If the pressure is there, people are more willing to share. And I think this is exactly what we're seeing now. And of course, this is something that I would like to see encouraged. I do believe that on a European level, and this is something that I hope that the Cancer Mission will also push for, is that I think that our research projects should put like more emphasis that data has to be like according to fair standards and has to be made open and shareable, and we have to encourage the reuse of the data in there. So I think it's a bit like we're putting our first toe into this big lake. I think it's a process. It's not quite as easy as we thought. There are many little caveats, but I do see that we are already moving. And of course, now we see with COVID that data sharing helps to solve problems. And I think this recognizing and valuing the potential is an important step, because unless you see why you should be doing it and what it could do for you, why would you bother? So I think that's something in this data space that's tricky to communicate, because data is abstract. It doesn't, I mean, cancer is something way more concrete than just data. So I think where the issue around data is that it's an abstract concept that's not very easy to communicate, and value of data is an abstract term. But now we have actually the opportunity to show concretely how it saves lives, and I hope we benefit in cancer from that later on.
Thank you. And Nathalie, following up on that, what about real-time patient data? Is there a possibility where we can see that we could grab this and start using real-time data more? Will the crisis offer more of an opportunity to use robust and useful data real-time? And this is a question from Stefan Gisels. What do you think?
Yeah. I think what's really been helpful is that even before the crisis, as EFPIA, we were advocating really for real-world evidence. We were looking really how to integrate into the normal regulatory pathways that are perhaps not up to date in that element. How we could integrate through guidances the feedback that we were getting. And I think that well, we found very open reception on the part of regulators to that. And even there's a specific word that I always forget about evolving regulatory input. So I think, and it's not the right word, but I'll get it eventually when it comes back to my mind. But I think that there really is, as we've said many times, the crisis has really focused us on finding solutions very quickly. And it's true, Bettina, you mentioned optimization is not enough. I don't think that optimization is a solution, but we shouldn't forget to optimize while we create new things, because otherwise we're missing a huge opportunity to clean things up that, you know, we'll deal with that later. So I think, no, I think here there should be that just the digital platforms that we're putting in place, because people have to be treated from home, because we have to interact with patients or healthcare practitioners in a different way. There must be use for those afterwards. We can't just drop them and, you know, say, oh, that was good, but now we go back to the way things were before. So I think there's a big opportunity, and we see a lot of openness at the level of regulators as well.
Yeah, I'm going to quote something that Martin has said on occasion, which he calls pilot-itis, which I love, one of Martin's great expressions. I mean, we have seen data used, even, you know, I'll take issue with something Bettina said, and we don't use for phase 1 safety. If you look at what's happening with CAR T treatments right now, you actually see that CAR T treatments are being monitored at home for adverse events just because it's more efficient. So we can manage adverse events and monitoring from home. And I do think going to a phase 1 is possible. So I do think we have the opportunity to expand the technology base. Maati, from your position at ECCO, how are you folks seeing this issue with real world evidence from a research value perspective? Are you driving that bus, as it were?
Well, this is a topic which one of the ECCO members has been looking at very carefully, and this is the European Organization for Research and Treatment of Cancer, URTs, that is running studies, and many others, member societies want to look at this. One of the issues that we have been discussing also in the development of the ideas of the mission and of the Beat Cancer Plan is that while we talk about the possibility of sharing, we always have this ghost that comes behind us called GDPR, which I think has been a very good intent and is misused, and which really needs to be revisited, because many of my colleagues that are doing clinical research are complaining that now with this one, their life is much more complicated, and you can have all kinds of patient approvals of everything. There's always someone in some commission saying, oh, no, you cannot do that. No, you cannot share it. So I think we need to work on that, but I'm certain that we will be able to work on that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be an oncologist. I'm an optimistic person.
Nathalie, is GDPR an issue?
I think that, there are some adaptations in GDPR. We're using to every extent possible the research facilitations or exclusions, or I don't know how you want to call them, under GDPR at the moment, to be able to really maximize indeed the use of data to go faster. And I think that there we have to take learnings. I mean, it's a new instrument that we have that is extremely important, of course. But I think that situations like this help us to take stock and very quickly analyze, okay, to what is this a barrier, in fact, to being able to go to the extent that we need to, and we should take the learnings from that. So certainly from the research side, from the industry side, we're doing everything that we can in the context of GDPR, but we are noting some barriers that we will feed back.
Yep, I think the general feedback we've had from people we're working with on this issue is it's okay within country, but trying to move data across country is extremely problematic. And that's where this needs to be revisited. Yeah, precisely. Deputy Director General Seychell, I have a question here for you from Sarah Wheaton. I believe Sarah works for Politico. What are the key points that Santé is contributing to the Commission's broader recovery plan? How, if at all, is the COVID-19 experience prompting any changes to the pharmaceutical strategy overall? Care to comment, Martin?
Indeed. I mean, if anything, it has made the pharmaceutical strategy even more necessary.
Yeah.
And I think it's very much linked with what we're discussing previously. So certainly it will be a big part of the recovery. We have to look at various aspects, how we've lost a lot of ground over the years in Europe as a hub for innovation, but also we need to see how we can not only recover that, but improve. There's a lot that can be done also to ensure, we're mentioning just a moment ago, the use of data. You cannot have innovation, you cannot have transformation without also using this very important means, this resource. The pharmaceutical strategy, obviously, I would say has even become more relevant because of also some issues which have become very obvious, like the need to ensure greater security of supply, to ensure that we also pay greater attention to unmet needs, for example. I mean, there are many areas, both in cancer care and elsewhere, infectious disease and so on, where we need to find new ways of incentivizing interest in developing treatments for these major or potentially major unmet needs. And there are many of them in healthcare. So I think this will obviously, if anything, call for an even stronger pharmaceutical strategy, which is what we are working on at the moment. And of course, to use the lessons learned from such a painful experience to also really bring out, as others have said before, this is not a theoretical exercise. This is something very, very real, unfortunately, but something we could also put in place to be much better prepared for whatever comes next, whenever it comes. And I think there are some clear signs of the direction in which we should be heading there.
Thank you. Bettina, any comment on the pharmaceutical strategy right now from your perspective?
Well, you know where I'm coming from. Our people are still dying. We need results, and as soon as possible. So of course, it is something that we would very much value, not just as strategy, but we also know that phase 1 trials often do not run in Europe. And we would hope that by a strengthening of the strategy, we see more early research, which I alluded to earlier, is the lifeline for our people. So I have hopes. I would very much, or we would very much support that, because it would mean direct benefit for cancer patients in Europe.
Nathalie, what's your opinion?
Yeah, I think lessons learned, certainly, areas that Martin has already mentioned and Bettina also mentioned. Now, I think the research and innovation element is really crucial, because otherwise we will be at the behest of other regions, and I don't really want us to just be importing solutions when there are no flights and nothing works. I think it's very important to be able to have the attention to the entire ecosystem of healthcare that includes research and innovation, and I think that's important. The other thing I would really think is important is, in the pharmaceutical strategy, whatever it looks like in the end, that the collaboration among stakeholders, the discussion of key issues, like whatever they may be, access, research, etc., there is a forum, a place where we can have that conversation together with member states and EU institutions, because we've seen how well the interaction between EU institutions and stakeholders has gone very quickly, the adaptation continuously. Member states have had their challenges, have difficulties, but until we have that continuum of conversation with all the stakeholders and the member states and the institutions, we will be every time held back, and we can't afford to be held back anymore.
Thank you. Maati, do you have a comment? Yeah, I would like to ask a question, Nathalie, because you mentioned member states, but in my work, what I've also seen is that it's not only the states, it's the regions within states that complicate the lives of everyone, of the doctors, of the industry. And I think that we really need to revisit all of this at the European level, trying to convince everyone that there's no need to reinvent the wheel in every single state, in every single region, when the final goal is beat cancer and do it in the most efficient way. So why should we have 27 different solutions, and within the 27 then sub-solutions in every region? It just doesn't make any sense.
Bettina's raising her hand. She's being very polite. Yes, Bettina, go ahead.
Yeah, you don't see the electronic one, so I thought I'd do this the old-fashioned way. I think one has to be a little bit careful about I think what I care about is I think we have to pay attention to outcomes. So what delivers outcomes? And I'm actually not entirely sure that one size fits all will be the solution. There is actually a question that has been answered, which I don't think has been answered. Someone says, like, actually, is there something like a best sharing of best practices, how we can actually ensure continuity of cancer care? And I actually think this is something we should be doing. At the same time, I've read recently a very good article in The Guardian about testing and which countries have been effective in ramping up their testing capacity. And Germany was one of the countries counted at that. And now, if you know anything about Germany, and I'm German by origin, it is super, super federal. Everyone does their own little thing, and that's just exactly the opposite of what Maati just advocated for. However, in this particular scenario, it has been very effectively allowing them to ramp up testing capacity. So I think it is about finding that balance, which things we should be doing together and in which things we need regional autonomy and subsidiarity, which, I mean, Europe is built on a subsidiarity principle, and I think rightfully so. You don't want to be deciding in one place where to put the zebra crossing in your village. That makes no sense. And we have heard Martin said that health has to be provided close to citizens because that's where they get sick. And there's also a cultural component. We've seen this in our network, that we have a European network, and how people think about health and how they want to be treated very much depends on where you live, and there's no right or wrong. So one size will be totally inappropriate to everyone because the average will never be just. So I think it is about finding this balance. It probably will come down to communication. So how do we learn? How do we spread learnings? How do we spread alerts? If someone picks up something that's wrong, and I think that's what the German system benefited from, several people got worried, and that led to a reaction. While if you have one person make a decision and that person doesn't wake up, an entire country suffers. So I think it's about fine-tuning our policy structures or our communication structures in there that will hopefully allow us to scale and answer more rapidly. So I think it's about getting this balance right. So I'm interested in, like, innovation in that space. So I don't think that one size is the answer.
And also, Bettina, let's be...
I didn't say that one size fits all.
Go ahead.
No way.
I also think there's one thing we need to look about, and that is, Brexit. There's a lot of concern about how much Europe there is. I mean, there's a big philosophical discussion here. So there are certain things we need to be concerned about as well, just beyond cancer treatment and federalization. Nathalie, you wanted to jump in quickly, did you not? I believe you did.
No. I've said my part on this.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, please, Maddie, go ahead.
Step in about Brexit, because if I may remind everyone, I'm based in Switzerland, and Switzerland is officially not part of the European Union, but we work very closely. And I think that I'm very hopeful that this will also happen with Great Britain. And we should not forget that Norway is also part of Europe, not officially of the European Union, but works very closely. So
absolutely.
So I think that that's not the issue. Health should be beyond that, and we should not forget that Europe can also be one of the helpers for the rest of the world that is suffering, those that have absolutely no means compared to ours, and we should not forget them.
Martin, you wanted to jump in, sir. Yes.
Yes, I mean, of course, the subsidiarity issue should not mean that member states or regions should be left on their own. So there is, I think, an important need, and I think we already have quite a lot of good experience with creating common shared infrastructure that member states and regions could all utilize. I mentioned the example of the European reference networks for rare diseases, including rare cancers and pediatric cancers, which also, I think, shows way things will increasingly be done in the future, that you bring together your network using technology, but also creating funding and other frameworks to ensure that we don't have peripheries. We don't have regions or countries that have to accept poorer outcomes just because of where they are or who they are. We need to ensure that subsidiarity does not mean that we accept that outcomes can be very different and there's nothing we can do about that. That's not the right interpretation of subsidiarity. It means we do things differently, but also we can all rely on common support infrastructure where that could make a difference. And there are many, many examples of that, and others are also possible.
Thank you, Martin. Unfortunately, we've got tons more questions we could ask. We're out of time, but I would like to just get one final comment from everybody. If I could ask you to be brief, 10, 15 seconds at most. Nathalie, one recommendation you would like to make to ensure that we improve cancer outcomes post-COVID-19?
So I've said it 1,000 times, collaboration across healthcare. Don't focus with the most urgent, but don't lose sight of the long-term challenges. So continue the Europe's Beating Cancer Plan. We also propose, together with ECCO and ECCO, the creation of a European cancer dashboard to measure progress in tackling cancer. It's only really when you measure that you know the size of the challenge and you know where things progress. And really, we need to continue investing our resources in beating cancer, because it is feasible. Thank you.
Thank you. Maati, for you, what's the one final recommendation you would make for the standpoint of ECCO?
Nathalie said it already. We have to work together. We should learn from this, that together we'll be much stronger than alone.
Thank you. Martin, from your perspective, what do you think we need to do?
Yes, I would say, let's focus on addressing and bridging the inequalities. I mean, inequalities are, of course, very negative, but it does mean also that at least somebody is doing things reasonably well. And it means we can help bring the others up to that level. So that's an obvious place to start. Where you have an inequality, you can actually try to converge on the higher level. And Europe, I think, is very well placed to support that process. We have multiple instruments we can use to that effect.
Thank you. And Bettina, the last word to you. What recommendation would you make?
That's, of course, very unfair to be the last. I think well, I'm not known for patience, and I think what we've seen now is that people are willing to try new things, and it comes very stupid. I mean, TCs, all of a sudden everyone can use Google Docs, which has been impossible for the years before. So there is a willingness to try and to put yourself through learning something new and altering ways we've done for years. And I would like to see that stick around afterwards. So there is an appetite for new, better, faster learning and testing, because it doesn't come ready, but there's this willingness to try new things and improve fast on them. And this iteration I find very, refreshing to see. And I would like to see some of that sticking around afterwards. And I think that's the take-home message for us. We have to change the way we work if you really want to have speed afterwards, and not just fall back into our old way of doing things.
Thank you very much, Bettina, for the 500 people we had on the webinar. Thank you for your participation. Nathalie, Maati, Martin, and Bettina, thank you all for your participation. And with that, this webinar is finished. Thank you very much.